Welcome to Things You Don't Know, where the past leans in, whispers something scandalous, and dares us to rethink everything. I'm Dr. William Weaver.
I'm Dr. Sean Deneen. Today, we're talking about a general who just didn't win battles. He ruled a nation. For 6 years after World War II, General Douglas MacArthur wasn't just the supreme commander of Allied powers, he was in many ways the uncrowned shogun of Japan.
Yeah, post-war Japan, huh? He uh he really did things a little differently, didn't he?
Absolutely. I think he understood the Asian mind and the stereotype of the time, and he really wanted to convert a people that had been a vicious enemy into a friend for both political and humanitarian reasons.
Dr. Deneen, you once called MacArthur's time in Japan, quote, the most profound act of foreign stewardship since the British Raj. What did you mean?
Well, he governs as a military dictator cloaked in benevolence, but as I said, he really wanted to transform the nation. Unlike a lot of colonial rulers, MacArthur wasn't there to enrich the U.S. He came to reshape Japan, root and branch. And get this, he did it from the top floor of the Daiichi building in Tokyo, like a modern daimyo, that's an old term for governor, dispensing edicts.
Let's rewind here a little bit. The war ends with Japan's surrender in August of 1945. The country is starving. Cities lie in ashes. The emperor's divinity is shattered. Into this walks Douglas MacArthur, tall, pipe in his mouth, hat tilted just so. A man who sees himself as destiny in sunglasses. That's a great word picture, isn't it?
It
He
is.
stepped off the plane in Tokyo, refusing bodyguards, and told his men, the Japanese respect strength. Let them see it. The people were awestruck. To them, MacArthur looked like a war god. To Emperor Hirohito, a judgment. And then the unthinkable happens. The emperor, whose ancestors supposedly descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, bows to MacArthur, and they take a photo. The tall American towering over the frail monarch. That photo was banned in Japan, but MacArthur had it printed on the front page.
He did so for a very good reason. It sent a message. The old order was dead. A new one had come, and its name was democracy with a MacArthur twist.
One of MacArthur's first acts was purging the Japanese military elite. Nearly 200,000 officials were removed. Imagine that. Not arrested, not hanged, just made irrelevant. A bloodless decapitation.
It was very effective. It's quite a contrast to what Paul Bremer did in the 2000s when he took charge of Iraq. We're probably going to create a podcast comparing the two later. But one of the most important things that MacArthur does is to create a new Japanese constitution. It's written in English by MacArthur's staff, including a 22-year-old graduate of Radcliffe, that's the female Harvard, named Beat Sirota Gordon, and it's translated into Japanese. It forever bans war, gives women the vote, guarantees all forms of human rights, denounces the emperor's divinity, and even promotes labor unions. Now, MacArthur was a very conservative Republican. For someone like him to embrace a left, what he would have seen as a left leaning constitution, is an amazing change.
You're telling me A group of Americans wrote the Japanese Constitution and they accepted it?
They did. They wrote the whole thing, which is 40 pages long, in about a week. It was very radical. As I said, it stripped the emperor of political power, dismantled the feudal codes, and even created government style recreation programs to bring good relations between business people and employees. We'll talk more about that later. But MacArthur sold it like a product. He said Japan will become the Switzerland of Asia.
Well, that didn't quite happen.
True, it didn't. But you know what, Dr. Weaver? Something even stranger did. Japan brought the American dream as imposed by a foreigner with a brilliant mind and an even bigger ego.
Okay, now let's talk of food and fear, two big F's, because this wasn't just about democracy. This was survival. Japan was starving.
It absolutely was. For a vital part of Asia to be in total collapse like that at the beginning of the Cold War was not good. So MacArthur begged Washington for aid. Please give me bread, he says, not bullets. Over 800,000 tons of food were shipped in a 2-month period. At the same time, he launched massive land reform. Tenant farmers, who had been treated like Russian serfs or sharecroppers for centuries, who were over half the population, were given land grants by the government. For many Japanese, that was the moment they belonged not just to their village or the emperor, but to the idea of Japan for the very first time. They had a stake in society, and people that can own property, land, work, and live as they please, they're less likely to riot and start uprisings.
Yeah, and while the people were fed, communism was kept at bay. Let's not forget, this was the beginning of the Cold War. MacArthur hated the Soviets. Oh, he wanted nothing more than a bulwark of freedom in the Pacific. He censored left wing newspapers, cracked down on unions, and promoted conservative parties. The Liberal Democratic Party, which ruled Japan for most of the post war era, owes its rise to MacArthur's anti red instincts.
The Liberal Democratic Party is a corporatist party. We did a podcast on that. To remind people very briefly what it is, corporatism is a link between business, politicians, and labor unions where they all sort of thrash out economic and cultural policy together. But MacArthur understood that the Japanese needed symbols. Now, he gives them their best symbol in himself, this swaggering American rebuilding their lives and changing them, whether they liked it or not. But he understands the value of the emperor. So let's linger on Hirohito for a moment. There was a great deal of controversy of how much power the emperor had had in the militaristic era beginning in the 1930s. Did he decide to go to war with the West? Did he authorize the rape of Nanking and the abuse of American and British prisoners and the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere? See our Deals with the Devil podcast to learn about Japanese efforts to work with Indian nationalists. But MacArthur understood that getting rid of the emperor would not be a good idea. He had to be stripped of political power and divinity, but he had to remain. MacArthur insisted the emperor stay on the throne, not as a god, but as a political symbol. That decision was very controversial. Some wanted Hirohito tried for war crimes. There is a wonderful film in which Tommy Lee Jones plays MacArthur, simply called The Emperor, that goes into great lengths about that decision. MacArthur said, destroy the emperor and you destroy the soul of the Japanese people. He kept him, tamed him, and in the process made him the mascot of the new democratic Japan.
There's something intimate in their relationship.
Very much so. It seems almost um, family oriented. Hirohito would often visit MacArthur's headquarters like a schoolboy visiting a very stern uncle. The emperor once said at the very beginning of the occupation, I have come to offer myself for punishment on behalf of my people. But MacArthur waved it off. Even in the famous photograph we'd mentioned, he offers him a cigarette, like a parent giving a child a piece of candy for a good report card. That gesture, that humility may have saved Japan from civil war.
Dr. Deneen, it wasn't just political power that got reshaped under MacArthur. Japan's entire economic model was redesigned, and not just by the general himself, but by his brain trust, a cadre of policy wonks, economists, and ex-New Dealers determined to build a bulwark against communism.
You're quite correct. That's totally right. By 1948, the Red Scare was heating up. Mao was winning in China, the British were under assault in Singapore and Malaysia, and leftist unions in Japan were getting bolder. MacArthur's advisors, especially men like Colonel Charles Reichel and Congressman Joseph Dodge, saw the writing on the wall.
You know what great foresight that shows. They were fearing a left wing uprising more than a militarist comeback because, we know that things start in small ways. From the small acorn, the mighty oak grows. And we see that time and time and time again. When ideas get planted, they sprout, they grow, they morph. And recognizing the deficits of communism. See, communism is sold as a wonderful thing in many ways. And it sounds great. They're a tenet of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That sounds great. It won't work.
No, people will not work if they don't get an incentive for their work. If their work goes to a party bureaucracy or a military elite or a secret police, they'll do the bare minimum to avoid ending up in a prison camp, but they won't give their best if it doesn't benefit them and their families.
The thing about that is not just the incentive to work, but it is the fact that when you have a government that is in place for a long period of time, look at any of them. Look at Putin, for example. All right. He's been there a long while. And the longer you are, it's like a fermentation process that occurs. The corruption, the the unilateral thinking, the obliteration of any opposing viewpoints, that breeds a terrible, terrible brew that ruins countries, flattens people, and makes it impossible for real growth.
Well, another reason is as leaders stay in power that long, they develop what is called a personality cult, and they're surrounded by sycophants who just tell them what they want to hear, so they aren't even aware of the changes they might need to make. But what did the elites around MacArthur do to avoid a left-wing uprising? They basically make a deal, kind of a lot of unwritten rules and a quiet revolution. As I said, They build what we call a corporatist economy. The government works with big business, offering them contracts and aid. The big businesses, Japan, Toyota, Mitsubishi, the great car dealers that will take over the medium-sized car market from Americans very fast. Nippon Steel also, electronics companies and so on, to guarantee lifelong high employment, lifelong well-paying jobs, continuously rising wages, and as I said, government sanctioned and business sanctioned hospitals and social activities. It's sort of a good version of a American company town. And in exchange for that, um, employees have to be loyal. There has to be a lot of discipline, and there has to be a suppression of radical labor movements and left-wing politics.
And I don't entirely agree with all of that. I think labor movements have their place for sure. Uh, any kind of radical ideas cannot be just summarily dismissed, but it worked for Japan. The factories were humming and strikes were tamed.
Labor movements and grievance movements in general were co-opted more than out and out forbidden. They were permitted, but they weren't militant. Workers became part of the company family. Remember what I said a long time ago about Confucian and Buddhist culture, this idea of collectivism instead of individualism, the five great relationships. So workers get housing, frequent bonuses, birthday and holiday gifts from their bosses, but they also get a message. Stay in your spot, do what you're told, and don't rock the boat. Even the worldwide entertainment practice that's called karaoke of people singing together, that was created in Japan to promote bonding between bosses and
And
employees.
boy, did it take off in many, many ways. And still is. I mean, it's still a thing.
I've done it myself, and my sister Kelly just loves it, and she does it with our church and other groups as well all the time.
It's sort of a benevolent machine, like you say. Don't rock the boat, stay in your lane, do what you're told. I'm not sure that I totally agree with all that, but okay.
Well, I don't think it would work in a more westernized society, but it works a lot in Asian countries, Japan, Taiwan, of course. Remember our ice cream propaganda podcast from a long time ago. Singapore, same sort of thing. They call that Disneyland with the death penalty. But it is a very tightly run but ultimately benign machine. The old Zabatsu, the business conglomerates that had come out of the fascist period prior to World War II, were broken up, but their DNA survived in what's called the Kiretsu system, interlinked companies, state-guided capitalism, banks that received large amounts of government money, and it was all underwritten by Cold War dollars and the fear of a communist takeover, what was called the Red Tide in those days.
Yeah. And here's the irony. It worked. By 1955, Japan had gone from ashes to assembly lines, radios, watches, sewing machines. Japan was back on its feet and marching to a new rhythm.
Well, MacArthur and his advisors call it stability. The Japanese call it an economic miracle. I remember in the 80s, people were terrified that Japan might overtake the United States as the world's biggest economy. But make no mistake, that miracle was engineered, programmed, and it came with a cost. Individualism was curbed, dissent was muffled, but the trains ran on time and the paychecks arrived.
So, what ended this reign? Why did MacArthur leave?
The Korean War. In June of 1950, North Korea, under the great leader Kim Il-sung, invaded the South. MacArthur led the United Nations military response. Brilliantly at first, the Incheon landing was a masterstroke, but then he pushed too far. He wanted to bring Taiwan into the war, wanted to bomb mainland China, even threatened to drop atomic weapons if Chinese soldiers didn't surrender to him personally.
Hmm. And then came the great conflict. President Truman and MacArthur. Well, they got into it big time. MacArthur was edging on the idea of, I'm the military leader. I know what the heck I'm doing. I'm going to do what I need to do, what I want to do. President Truman said, no, I'm the president. I am in charge. MacArthur went public. Truman fired him.
Which was a controversial decision at the time, but probably the right thing to do, is one has to have absolute civilian authority over the military, or we'd start having military juntas. So in April of 1951, MacArthur leaves Japan to a hero's farewell. Garlands, tears, Boy Scout troops and school children lining the streets. And yet he's done. He fades into retirement, making that famous speech to the Congress where he says, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. So his career is over. But Japan, it doesn't fade, it rises.
So, Sean, what lessons can we take from MacArthur's, shall we call it, imperial moment?
That's a brilliant use of that phrase. I think for once, this occupation was about restoration and transformation of hearts, not plunder. One man's arrogance can sometimes build a democracy. I think MacArthur was building, in a certain sense, on what his father had done as Governor General of the Philippines back in the early 1900s. But there's an important lesson we need to know. Above all, history is not about Star Wars villains or absolute saints. It's about contradiction. MacArthur was a Caesar and a Democrat, a brilliant military and political strategist with an ego a mile wide, a peacock and a pragmatist.
And Japan today, its pacifism, its constitution, its alliance with America, all bear MacArthur's fingerprints. The American Shogun, they called him, and for 6 years he ruled not with a sword, but with a pen and a pipe, and also some compassion and understanding of the Japanese people. He did respect them. And I think that that is probably one of the defining factors here. Listen, I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. William Weaver, and we have a lot of things coming up, and I hope you'll join us.
And I'm Dr. Sean Deneen. Please check out our Taiwan ice cream propaganda for another example of this sort of benevolent brainwashing on the part of, in this case, a Taiwanese civil servant. And also our podcast about the Japanese soldiers that were found in the 70s did not know the war was over. One gentleman, I won't give the whole story away, insisted on a meeting with the emperor and was so ashamed about losing the war, he said he would commit suicide, and Hirohito, as a sane individual, talked him out of it. That's a brilliant story. This has been Things You Don't Know. Until next time, give us a like, comment, suggestions. As Dr. Weaver said, many important things coming up. And always, friends, keep asking questions, even if the answers sometimes come in broken English and a general's drawl. Goodbye, folks.
Bye for now.